I am Clint Otto. I'm a new research ecologist with the United States Geological Survey. I'm stationed in Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center in Jamestown, North Dakota. And principally what I'm developing with my new research program is a series of projects to understand how land use change impacts a variety of ecosystem services, both within the prairie pothole region and abroad. The prairie pothole region is represented by basically the northern Great Plains, if you will, principally North Dakota, South Dakota, a little bit of Iowa, Minnesota, and then eastern Montana as well. And I thought it'd be best to start with a picture to show, and make sure it's actually going to forward here. Very good. There's a picture here of kind of an iconic North Dakota landscape, if you will. This is a photograph that was taken about 30 miles due north of our research center. And I think the photo does a good job of highlighting the diversity of ecosystem services that the prairie pothole region provides humanity. You can see in the foreground here there's commercial beehives, apiaries, and that's a service with a huge economic impact. For example, nationwide, honey production is estimated at $250 million a year, but that's a relatively small quantity compared to the pollination services that commercial bees provide U.S. agriculture, and that's an ecosystem service that's estimated at between $15 and $30 billion, billion with a B, per year in U.S. agriculture. But North Dakota also provides other services as well. We can see in the background the wind turbines there to provide alternative energy, taking advantage of North Dakota's rather unique climate. In the background also, you unfortunately can't see the cattle in this picture, but across the river there, that's open rangeland and grazelands for cattle, either bison or domestic beef. And then on the right side of the screen are lands that are enrolled, private lands enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program. And that's a program that's run by the United States Department of Agriculture and managed by the Farm Service Agency. And it's a rental agreement between a private landowner and the United States government, where the farmer agrees to not plant crops in return for a rental check. And usually these lands are then planted in a variety of seed mixes, such as grasslands or a diverse forb component, to provide a variety of ecosystem services, such as prevention of soil erosion, carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat, and providing forage for pollinators, which you see there in the picture. But our North Dakota landscape, and indeed the rest of the prairie pothole region, is changing. And we see here we're in North Dakota and the PPR abroad, we see a general transition from native prairie and small grain production, as well as Conservation Reserve Program lands, being converted to commodity crops, specifically corn and soybeans, for the production of biofuel. And this started all basically back in the turn of the 21st century, but the biofuel engine really got churning in 2006 when President George W. Bush mentioned biofuels production in his State of the Union address. And so our task here is with my research team, we are looking at the impacts of this land use change, biofuels production principally, on a variety of ecosystem services. And fortunately for my part, when I've only been here a year at Northern Prairie, but fortunately for me, my team has been studying the impact of land use change on ecosystem services for a number of years. And what I have here is a map of the prairie pothole region, just to give you an indication again where it resides, and just an outline, a brief overview of some of the other projects that my team members have been participating on. For example, Dave Maché and Chip Eulis have looked at the spatial distribution of carbon across the PPR, as well as where does the amphibian habitat resides. And then they've conducted a series of scenario-based modeling using the program INVEST to look at how changes in conservation lands and gains and losses, principally in the Conservation Reserve Program, alters the distribution of stored carbon and amphibian habitat. So this just gives you an indication of the diversity of services that my team and I are looking at. But today I'm going to touch on two of my developing projects that I'm working on with Chip Eulis and Dave Mache, and this deals with the birds and the bees. So we're looking at how modification of habitat and land use change in the prairie pothole region impacts grassland birds as well as domesticated honeybees. And just to give you a kickstart on what we're looking at, here is a map, a land use map that outlines a majority of the dominant cover types that you would find in North Dakota. And this map is basically an entire county somewhere between Devil's Lake, North Dakota and Grand Forks, North Dakota. And this image was developed in 2006. The green is grassland, the red is row crops, so biofuels crops for that are principally corn and soybeans. And then we have in the orange are small grains, your wheats and barleys and so forth. And this is 2006 when the President George W. Bush mentioned biofuels in his State of the Union address. And we're going to now flash forward to 2012. And this is what we have in 2012, again highlighting that transition going from more conservation grasslands and small grains to principally biofuels production, corn and soybeans. And you'll also note, I'll flash back here again, you'll also note the gain in water. So we have this synergy that's taking place with land use change as well as climate change. And our team is attempting to model those effects on biodiversity. A little bit about the data that we used for the project. I won't get too much into the details, but we took advantage of a spatially and temporally robust data source called the Breeding Bird Survey. This is a nationwide survey. Indeed, it includes parts of Canada. There are currently almost 4,000 active routes, and it was initiated in 1966 at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, and it's been going on to the present day. In fact, in 2013, the BBS observers, Breeding Bird Survey observers, just completed their routes in June and July, so we'll have the 2013 data source available to us relatively shortly. And it's publicly available. Anyone can use it, and there's the website on the bottom of the page. But this just gives you an indication of what we're looking at, of the data, the raw data we can utilize. I have 5 species outlined here, 5 iconic grassland birds, if you will: bobolinks, clay-colored sparrows, grasshopper sparrows, savanna sparrows, and western meadowlarks. And these breeding bird observers go out, and they have 50 stops that they have along their survey route. And at each stop, they get out of their vehicle and listen for 3 minutes and identify all the birds that they can hear and see within that 3-minute period. And then they get counts of the number of birds they detected. For example, in 2006, a single breeding bird observer at this particular point detected 9 bobolinks. In 2009, they detected 6 at that same point, and then in 2012, they didn't detect any bobolinks. So we can utilize this information then to develop species distribution models to look at how land use change at this very small scale, if you will, at the individual BBS stop, how that impacts the spatial distribution of these variety of grassland bird species. A little bit about how we're quantifying land use change. What I have here is just a time series, if you will, of 5 BBS stops. So each stop, if you will, right in the center of this black circle, there should be a dot. And that dot is where that Breeding Bird Survey observer stopped and conducted their 3-minute point count for those grassland bird species. And then we can take 3 time steps, 2006, 2009, and 2012, and quantify land use change within a 400-meter buffer around each one of our BBS stops. And I should mention right now we have 300 BBS stops, so a sample size of 300 data points, but very soon we will be expanding that both temporally and spatially into about 3,000 data points. And those models are currently being developed. But as you can see, at this particular study area, there's this general transition of going from conservation grasslands in green to that of biofuels crops, principally corn and soybeans. And so we can quantify the change and then develop an empirical model to look at how these grassland birds, the distribution of these grassland birds has shifted at a very small scale, the scale that farmers are making individual land use decisions, and see how that impacts the breeding birds. All right, some very qualitative results, and you'll have to bear with me. I am using the English units here because one of our partners, the Farm Service Agency, they of course deal principally with acreage rather than meters squared. But as you can see here, for example, between 2006 and 2009, on average, I'm looking at the third column here, and hopefully you can see my mouse scrolling over that -4. On average, there was a loss of 4 acres of row crops between 2006 and 2009 at each of our study sites. However, some farmers, in this one particular case, at one farmstead, there was a gain of 70 acres of row crops. And likewise, there was actually, at one farmstead, there was a loss of 74 acres. And this is a majority, at least this range here represents a majority of the actual total landscape, because each one of our BVS stops where we quantified land use change encompasses of an area of about 125 acres. All right, so now we go from 2009 to 2012 when that biofuels engine is really starting to churn, and we see on average at each one of our BBS stops there was a 9-acre gain in row crop acreage. So 9 acres of corn and soybeans that were added to the landscape that were not there in 2009. Likewise, we can look at, well, if we're gaining row crop acreage, what are we losing? And we're losing small grains, as I've suggested previously, roughly on average 2 acres per site, and we're also losing grassland, so native grasslands, conservation reserve program lands, rangelands, cattle, and grazing lands, for example. So losing grass between 2009 and 2012 and losing small grains. So there's that transition. And here's some of the correlation coefficients, if you will. If you want to look at, well, if we're gaining row crop acreage, what are we losing? And the correlation coefficients suggest that most of our gains in row crops, what is happening, farmers are choosing not to plant small grains. There's a strong negative correlation between gains in row crops and gains in small grains. So basically this graph tells you that if you gain row crop acreage, you're losing small grains and you're losing grasslands. And that trend is consistent even into 2009 to 2012. Again, we're seeing this strong correlation between gains in row crop acreage and losing small grains. And we're also seeing a modest correlation between gains in row crop acreage and grassland loss as well. But that just gives you an indication of how our landscape is changing. A little bit about our modeling results. This is basically a logistic regression model, not exactly, but not to get into too much of the details of the modeling aspect, but it's a hierarchical Bayesian model where we're estimating the probability that, for example, a western meadowlark that occupied a particular site along a BVS route, what's the probability if that species occurred there in 2006, what's the probability that it was absent in 2009? And can we explain that transition from going present to absent? Can we explain that transition as a function of gains and losses in row crop acreage, so our biofuels crops, corn and soybeans? And what our model is showing, for example, that a particular study site where a farmer chose to put 50 additional acres into row crop production, what's the probability that that site is going to become unoccupied by western meadowlarks? And our model shows that that probability is about 0.6, or if you'd like, a 60% chance that if there were meadowlarks present there in 2009, there's a 60% chance that meadowlarks will no longer occupy the site in 2009. Again, 50% gain in row crop acreage results in basically a 60% extinction probability, if you will. And we can play additional games if we'd like. Here's the next time step. So here we're looking at changes from 2009 to 2012. How do western meadowlarks respond to increased row crop production? The red line is the vacancy or local extinction probability, if you would prefer. And again, we can see there's this positive trend where if we gain row crop acreage, the probability that the site is vacated by western meadowlarks increases. And likewise, we see a decrease in the probability that that site is colonized by western meadowlarks. So colonization is just being absent at 2009 and being present at the study site in 2012. Well, what can we infer from this graph? As I mentioned, okay, the site vacancy probabilities increase. Birds that were no longer present, they're no longer present where they used to be if we gain a lot of row crop acreage. And the birds prefer not to colonize habitat that is relatively poor in terms of the amount of grassland and or small grains that are present there. So the birds are less likely to settle in new areas with high row crop production. And then we can infer, as a population biologist, we can infer that, hey, if our vacancy or local extinction rates exceed that of the probability that our sites are colonized, then we can say or infer that this population is in red. And if this trend continues throughout multiple years, we would say that these conditions are consistent with systematic population declines, and ultimately will represent a shift in the spatial distribution of this particular species. But there's some positive outlooks here that our models can shed some light on. That is, we can reach a population dynamic equilibrium with western meadowlarks, even if there's modest increase in row crop production. So for example, where these two lines cross, the green and the red, there's actually about a 9-acre gain in row crop acreage at each one of our study sites. So if we can achieve this equilibrium and just gain modest amounts of row crop acreage across our landscape, we can still prevent a systematic population decline in this particular species. Now this is just a representative, this is just an example of western meadowlarks, but we need to take a look at other species as well. And and also I thought a different slide was coming up, but will grassland birds respond to management that reduces emphasis on biofuels production? So we asked the question, if the farmer chooses, if these farmers choose to reduce the amount of corn and soybean acreage they have on their farmstead, how will these birds respond? And we see that at least western meadowlarks will respond quite favorably. That is, they have reduced site vacancy rates and increased colonization rates. Now note, we also don't have very many data points out here. That's because not too many farmers chose between 2009 and 2012 to reduce the amount of row crop acreage. But this limited evidence suggests that indeed the birds will respond favorably to changes in local land use decisions. All right, and we have our other species. I won't get too much into the details here. We have our other species that we've modeled. I'm not going to share with you those results. I can talk about it later if you'd like. And we are looking at other things. So it's not just about row crop gains and losses, but what happens if we lose grasslands? And what happens to our particular species of interest? And here I have a couple graphs for bobolinks, another iconic grassland bird. And we see if we gain grassland, so we increase grassland acreage, there's a reduced probability that the sites are vacated by bobolinks. So that is, the sites remain occupied by bobolinks. And there's slight gains in colonization probabilities. So the species will actually colonize or return to previously vacated sites at a higher rate if we gain grassland acreage. And we can also look at wetland change. Recall that I showed you that particular graphic where there was a lot of gains between 2006 and 2012 in the volume of water available on our landscape. And for bobolinks, we can see they respond quite favorably to that as well, where there's reduced vacancy rates and slight increases in colonization rates as we gain wetland acreage. All right. So future directions for this project. Of course, we think there's more to the story than just grasslands versus agriculture. There are some cover types, some agricultural cover types out there that can actually provide habitat for various grassland bird species. And so we believe it's important when moving this model forward to assess how these birds respond to different crop types at annual rotations. So the next phase of our modeling effort, we're going to include things like small grains into those models. And we also want to include a variety of grassland bird species that provide recreation opportunities, principally in the form of hunting, because that's a huge economic revenue source here in North Dakota, and indeed the prairie potholes as well. So things like sharp-tailed grouse, ringneck pheasants, and so forth, incorporating those species into our models and see how they respond to land use change. And then we want to actually develop some forecasting models that utilize some of the future land use scenarios developed from the ARROS data center in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and look at how the grassland birds are expected to respond to future land use change out to 2050. And we have the capabilities to do that. We have the spatial data layers that are required. And with the models that I've developed, we can actually, forecasting is relatively simple to do. And that's something we'll be working on this fall and winter. And then we also want to understand how land use decisions at the farm scale ultimately affect the distribution. So across the entire prairie pothole region, affect the distribution of grassland birds and the ecosystem services they provide. And then we're ultimately going to combine our results, our modeling results, with this one biodiversity aspect of ecosystem services and combine it with the integrated landscape modeling efforts that Chip Eulis and Dave Nashea have developed to develop an optimization model for a multifunctioning landscape that includes a variety of ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration, soil erosion, wildlife habitat, and pollination services. So we can see how individual land use decisions impact a diversity of services. All right, for the second study I'm going to share with you today, this is a very new project. This is in fact just developed over a couple months. And this is a collaboration between USGS and the Farm Service Agency to develop better forage for commercial bees on conservation reserve program lands. And this is something right now we're just in the pilot phase of this particular project, so I'll try to keep this relatively brief. But we're looking at methodologies that we can link what's going on in specific beehives in terms of beehive productivity and health and link that with the local landscape condition. And then ultimately utilize our results to inform the Farm Service Agency and how they can improve conservation lands to enhance habitat for pollinators and the services that they provide humanity. A little bit about pollination services in case you weren't aware. Excuse me. Over about 1/3 of all agricultural crops globally require some form of animal pollination services. And in the U.S., this is estimated at between $20 and $30 billion per year to U.S. agriculture. So we're talking about a lot of money here. And for example, 1.6 million commercial beehives are required to pollinate just almonds, principally in California, but other parts of the Pacific Northwest. And nationally, there are only 2.5 registered beehives in the U.S. So a majority of our U.S. beehives, commercial beehives, are actually going to California to pollinate a single crop. And right now, because of colony collapse disorder, there's considerable pressure on U.S. agriculture, especially in almond country, to make sure that we have enough bees to pollinate our nation's crops. And it's important from a land use perspective to recognize that between 60 and 85% of the U.S. pollination needs come from European honeybees that spend their summer in the northern Great Plains, so North Dakota, South Dakota, parts of Minnesota, Iowa, and eastern Montana. So the take-home message here is that habitat loss, pesticide use, nutritional deficiencies, parasites and disease, things that take place, stressors that take place in the northern Great Plains, has national impacts on agricultural productivity. So habitat loss, specifically in North Dakota, has some impact on the ability of honeybees basically to pollinate crops in almond country, for example, in North Dakota. And that's the linkage my team and I are trying to establish here to quantify how much is conservation lands in North Dakota and the prairie pothole region, how much is it worth to U.S. agriculture? And that's something that we've developed. We're working with an economist right now at the University of North Dakota to develop those models to look at how land use decisions in North Dakota and the PPR affect pollination services nationwide. Again, we're working with the Farm Service Agency, and the Farm Service Agency manages the Conservation Reserve Program. Back in 2006 or 2007, during the heyday of the CRP, there was about 35 to 37 million acres of conservation lands in the U.S. That, of course, has dwindled now to somewhere between, I believe the latest figure is between 25 and about 25 million acres of CRP, and this is a provision within the U.S. Farm Bill. And what we see what we're looking at is how to enhance this conservation reserve program lands, how to enhance it for pollinators. And you can see in the playas and the prairie potholes outlined in red, the playas in purple, there you can see that's where a majority of the CRP lands reside within the U.S. And so our study right now is focused principally on the prairie pothole region, but next year we plan to expand into the playas. And I should mention that most of the Conservation Reserve Program lands that are out there, at least in the prairies, most of it lacks a strong forb component. So the CRP has come under fire recently because it may not do enough, or it seemed to be deficient for providing habitat for native and non-native pollinators alike. And that's really our charge, is to work with FSA to develop cost-effective means to enhance the CRP program for native and non-native pollinators. What are we doing for this study? Well, first off, we're going to use historic data sets that have been collected since 2009 at a series of study sites in North Dakota to identify which plants are being most commonly visited by domesticated honeybees. And then we're also going to test a variety of methodologies that include stable isotopes and genetic markers to link individual pollen and nectar resources from specific plants ultimately with honeybee productivity and health. And so when I say productivity, I'm talking about honey production, and when I say health, I'm talking about immune system function and the ability of these bees to survive a very stressful time period in their life, which is in the wintertime when they're out pollinating things in the southern part of the United States or in the Pacific Northwest pollinating almonds. So looking at how land use decisions and various foraging, specific plants, how that impacts honeybee mortality nationwide during the wintertime. And then we also have a data set that allows us to look at the temporal windows of when the peak nectar flows occur within North Dakota and how these bees forage about the local landscape and utilize that information to inform pesticide application time. And this is something that's relatively new. This happened just over the past month, utilizing some of our available data to inform pesticide application time, because the agrochemical community, of course, in the landscape is applying a variety of pesticides on corn and soybeans to reduce pesticide loads, of course, or to limit pest application on these lands. Excuse me, I'm trying to do two things at once here, looking at my notes here on what I want to accomplish. But sorry. And then our fourth objective is to develop a comparative sampling methodologies for expanding our research into other states with a high concentration of CRP lands and commercial apiaries. All right, so what are we doing for this particular pilot project? Well, one is to look at bee productivity. We have a variety of high scales deployed at a series of study sites, and our study sites are comprised of two different treatments. One is we have a series of high diversity sites, which you can see in the upper right-hand corner here, highlighted in the green. So those green areas are grasslands that we've deemed highly valuable to honeybees, and we have a series of study sites that are principally in black dirt ag. So these are agricultural crops, corn and soybeans and small grains that have very limited value to honeybees. And at each one of our study sites we have a series of hive scales that are monitoring throughout the spring and summer, monitoring hive weight gains at 15-minute intervals. So these things are so precise that we can actually see when the bees leave in the morning, going about and foraging. So the hive would lose weight during that time, and then when they're returning, the worker bees are returning and they're burdened with pollen and nectar that they've gathered while foraging across the local landscape. So we can utilize this information then to look at how local climate is influencing bee foraging behavior, and ultimately when the bees remain in the box and are not out foraging, and then targeting those times for application of particular pesticides. Here's just an example of our current data set that we have from the hive scales. So on the y-axis we have daily gains in pounds, and then on the x-axis is a particular day. And these are 12 hive scales. Forgive the busyness of this graph, but I think it's pretty telling to plot our 12 hive scales. We have some in our high floral diversity sites and others in our low floral diversity sites. And you can take, for example, this particular point. I'm looking at the yellow line here on roughly June 23rd. We can see that this particular hive in a high floral diversity site gained almost 14 pounds. So that's a combination of several thousand worker bees out flying about and gathering pollen and principally gathering nectar off of the local landscape and bringing that back to the hive. And so on a single day, a gain of 14 pounds. And what we're using this information for is to look at what plants are flowering within this window of about June 20th to July 25th. What particular plant species are flowering in that landscape, and the bees are taking advantage of the various pollen and nectar resources. And we're utilizing this pilot data to then target specific plant species for future isotope and genetic analyses. And I'll share those results in just a few minutes. But we can see indications also on this graph of things occurring at our low floral diversity site, such as hive robbing. Here's an example of a single hive that lost about 7 or 8 pounds within a 24-hour period, and that occurred at 2 of our low floral diversity sites, suggesting that there may be not enough nutritional forage out for these particular bee species, and so, or this particular beehive, and so there are other hives that are basically ganging up on this particular hive and robbing it of its nectar and pollen resources. All right, well, what about pollen diversity? And pollen provides principally the protein that the bee is going to use, these hives are going to use when they're overwintering. And keep in mind that most of these bees that are in North Dakota, they are going to California in the winter to pollinate almond orchards. And so they're going to utilize this pollen that they gather in North Dakota to stay fat and happy, if you will, over that stressful pollination time in California. And we could see that sites in our high floral diversity sites generally are bringing in more pollen and a greater diversity of pollen when compared to our low floral diversity sites. And I would like to thank Jeff Puttis from USDA for providing this information from an ongoing study that he has taking place at our bee yards from 2009 up until present. All right, so as I mentioned, we're using the hive scale data then to inform what particular species of plants the bees are foraging on. And then what we're also doing this summer is collecting samples, reference sample of individual flowering plants off of the local landscape. So things like yellow sweet clover, white sweet clover, bladder campion, prairie rose, so on and so forth, to get reference samples that we can then run stable isotope analyses on. And this is just an output of a very preliminary study that we have, that data collected in late June, where we have stable isotopes plotted for nitrogen on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is carbon, and a variety of plant species here. And so what we're doing is sampling the local landscape to establish reference conditions, isotope reference samples for various plant species. And then we're going to utilize pollen samples that we've collected from our individual hive to plot against this graph to see what plant species the bees are foraging on. And then we can ultimately utilize this information to provide or to enhance the Conservation Reserve Program land, to enhance that land for pollinator forage. All right, well, what are some of our future directions? Again, this is very preliminary research. We want to be able to link our specific flowering plants with not only hive weight gains, but also bee health. And to do that, we're going to be sampling nurse bees this fall. The nurse bees are the ones that are going to be pollinating almond crops in the winter. And so we want to take a sample of those nurse bees to look at lipid storage and immune system function to see how the local landscape conditions actually influence bee health. What plant species are the bees utilizing? So we need to develop that. We need to determine those plant species so that we can inform the Farm Service Agency of what potential plant species they can utilize in the Conservation Reserve Program seed mixes, principally the native and non-native seed mixes, CP1 and CP2. And then also we want to inform pesticide application time. So pesticides are applied routinely in North Dakota, as well as the rest of the PPR, on a variety of agricultural crops, and we want to utilize that hive scale data to then see, well, when are the bees largely dormant? When are they in the hive, in the actual bee boxes, and not out foraging on the local landscape? If we can utilize this information, perhaps we can develop windows of time where pesticide application would cause minimal damage to these commercial beehives. And then lastly, I'll just put a plug out there for our native pollinator project. This is a very similar type of objectives to that of our project that's funded by the Farm Service Agency. And this is to look at how we can enhance pollinator habitat for native bees on national wildlife refuges. North Dakota has the most national wildlife refuges of any state in the union. And so we're working with a variety of refuge managers to not only determine what bee species they have present on their refuge, but also what plants these bees are foraging on, and how we can also provide adequate nesting habitat for these native bees. And I believe that is all I have at this time. Yep. And so I would be happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Clint. Great talk. Look forward to hearing some of the results of the honeybees work. A couple of questions came up throughout the your talk. Let me try to grab those. So one relating to what you were just talking about, is there any work of this type going on or on forest and agroforest stands for biomass?
Specifically for bees?
Yes, that was the one. I believe that was asked while we were speaking about the bees.
You know, not to my knowledge in forest lands, especially at least on public lands that I'm aware of. So that's all I can comment there. I will say that there is one of our collaborators from NASA, Wayne Azias, and he's been a beekeeper in the Mid-Atlantic region for over 20 years. And he is not looking at he's not looking at land use change, but he is looking at climate change in the Mid-Atlantic region and using some of the hive scale data that he's collected over the decades to look at how bee foraging behavior has changed as a function of climate change. And he's basically determined that over the past 20 years, these bees are foraging about a month earlier in Maryland and Virginia than they were historically. But in terms of land use condition, I am not aware of anyone that's actually looking at in forested-dominated ecosystems.
Okay. Jill had a question. What about native switchgrass being grown for biofuel?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I must say that at least in North Dakota, there is not much emphasis on switchgrass right now. In fact, my initial job description when I arrived here in North Dakota, I was supposed to work on cellulosic biofuels, so switchgrass being one of the dominant cellulosic biofuels, but there are basically no switchgrass plots that are available in North Dakota to even study. I do know that ARS has a couple research plots that include switchgrass, but they're on a pretty small scale. Most of our landscape in North Dakota is now dedicated to ethanol production, principally growing corn and soybeans and so forth. So switchgrass represents a relatively minor component on our landscape.
Going back to the beginning of your presentation, Altaskgrass, how much of the row crop production is no-till or reduced-till, and wouldn't no-till be more attractive for birds than clean-till?
Absolutely, without question, no-till would be more attractive for a lot of grassland birds. And no-till, I don't have any specific numbers on no-till, but it's generally actually influenced by the farming community neighborhood, if you will. There are a couple areas north of North Dakota, north of our research center, where individual farmers about 10 years ago has started implementing no-till farming practices. And that is caught on in local neighborhoods where some farmers will choose to do no-till farming. And we see a lot more of that actually up on the Coteau, west of town, where farmers are choosing to do no-till practicing, which is we think is better than tilling practice. But the downside is that a farmer can take a particular rangeland or even conservation reserve program lands, basically burn it, spray an herbicide in the fall, and then in the spring plant it in corn and soybeans. And I've seen this take place even in my short tenure here in North Dakota. I've only been here about a year, but I've seen some of these no-till plots that have basically gone from either native grass or pasture land or conservation reserve program land to no-till row crops, which I guess is a lesser of two evils if we're just comparing till versus no-till. But it's alarming at the rate of change that can actually take place with some of these no-till practices.
Okay, so Matthew Sarver has a comment. I assume that in your bee study you will be correcting for floral area when looking at bee visitation to various plant species. If not, I would highly recommend it, as preferences for various species will be masked by differences in floral area on the landscape. Any comments on that?
Yeah, that's a great comment, and I can I'll just address that. What we have at each one of our study sites where we have hive scales, we also have pollen traps, and these pollen traps are pretty much open 5 days a week throughout the spring and summer. And so we actually know, or we can get a sample of what the bees are bringing in from the local landscape. And for example, in a given week, we may have 2,000 individual pollen baskets that were attached to the bee scopa that have fallen off into the pollen traps. And what we can do is then do a random sample of those all available pollen baskets. So just take a random sample of 100 baskets and then run a stable isotope analysis on those. And that should give us a decent enough indication of the relative quantity of the various flowering plant species that are being visited, and will hopefully help us correct for area. But absolutely, I agree with the comment, and we also have field biologists that are out there surveying the landscape and quantifying the percent coverage within each one of our cover types, quantifying the percent coverage of our individual flowering plant species. And I didn't get into those details, but that is, yeah, it's an excellent comment and something we're attempting to control for.
Great. Well, I appreciate everyone's questions today and your participation, and thank you very much, Clint. It's a great talk, and really look forward to hearing the future of your work there.
All right. Well, thank you, Stephen. I appreciate it.
Okay. Folks, everything is going to be, has been recorded, and with Clint's permission, we'll post this online. And just as a reminder, please, let me just put this up real quick. Pay attention to invasiveplantcontrol.com for these different webinar series that we're going to be having coming up. And if you have any questions, send me an email. If you don't have Clint's email, you can send them to me, and then I'll make sure you guys touch base with each other. And I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Goodbye.